Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the second talk in the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience speaker series. Before we begin, let us please acknowledge the indigenous lands from which we are calling in today. The land I am calling in from and the surrounding areas are marked in name by the peoples from whom this land was taken, the Munsee Lenape people. The words Manhattan, Hoboken, Tappan Zee should serve as reminders of our land's traditional occupants. Please refer to the link in the chat to acknowledge and take a moment to reflect on where you're joining us from today. Through the recognition of past harms, we can resolve to create more equitable and humane futures for all. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Shelkin, and I'm a graduate student at Columbia University. On behalf of all of the students and postdocs on the organizing committee, I'm so happy to welcome you to our second talk in the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience speaker series. Collectively, we represent a consortium of schools, Dartmouth, Harvard, UPenn, Yale, Princeton, MIT, and Columbia, that are committed to highlighting innovative advances in cognitive neuroscience. We acknowledge that these schools are elite institutes of higher learning, and in order to de-silo the generation of knowledge within the ivory tower, we plan to make these talks publicly available with the consent of the speakers on the website for this talk series. Now I will hand it over to Mansi to further introduce today's talk.
Hi everyone, my name is Mansi Jayakumar. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, and today I'm going to quickly introduce the ICN series. The Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience recognizes outstanding research conducted by historically underrepresented groups in cognitive neuroscience and related fields, including women, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and individuals with disabilities. It is funded by Dr. Jim Haxby through the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, or CCN, at Dartmouth College. We also recognize that often our work does not directly address social issues impacting minoritized groups in society at large, and so to put the innovative in the ICN, we have asked all of our speakers to nominate a charity of their choice. Today, as you will see, the charity we're supporting is the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU. We ask that everyone who is attending today consider donating to this charity if they're able to. Together, we hope that we can bridge our science to the many pressing social issues that are entrenched in our society. Before I pass it on over to Luke, who will introduce our speaker, I just want to note that for today, we have a live ASL interpreter and live closed captioning. You can configure settings to show or hide these streams in the panelist video display. And now I will hand it over to Luke, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Mansi. Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Slipsky, and I'm a graduate student at Dartmouth College, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Natasha Parikh, our second speaker in the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience series. As an undergraduate, Natasha studied mathematical and computational biology at Harvey Mudd College and went on to get her PhD in psychology and neuroscience from Duke University in both the Labar Lab with Kevin Labar and the Imagination and Modal Cognition Lab with Felipe de Brigard. And Dr. Parikh is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Leah Somerville's lab at Harvard University, where she is continuing her work on novel emotional regulation strategies, and in particular, the strategy she will be telling you more about today, counterfactual thinking. Outside of her research, Natasha enjoys teaching in the psychology department as a college fellow. She also sings in a choir, enjoys playing board games, and likes to rock climb. In the name of counterfactual thinking, I asked Natasha first, if instead of being an innovator in cognitive neuroscience, you were to be an innovator in some other field, academic or otherwise, in what field would you innovate? And she said she would be an innovator in IT maybe, because she's been told that she gives soothing directions on how to work Zoom in a very calm voice and does so well and often. And everywhere she goes, she tends to become the go-to IT person. And finally, I asked her if instead of being a speaker series, the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience organization reached out to send you on a 1-month, all expenses paid vacation to anywhere in the world, where would you go? And she said Oceania at large, and in particular, Australia and New Zealand to hike and escape the cold winter. Without further ado, please now bring yourselves back out of your own Australian counterfactual reveries and welcome Dr. Natasha Parikh.
Thank you so much, Luke, for that introduction. And thank you so much to the Innovators for Cognitive Neuroscience for hosting this. I'm so honored to be here, and I've been having a lovely time so far. And so, as was mentioned, we get the chance to highlight a cause. And so I chose to highlight the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why I chose the ACLU. And so the ACLU is a foundation that focuses on fighting for civil liberties around the country. And this includes across a wide range of areas. And so here are just some of the areas that they focus on. I wanted to highlight some of the ones that I specifically find really important. And so some of the things that they've been doing recently include fighting for Indigenous rights, including land reparations, making sure that they have the right to vote, as well as fighting against discrimination against Indigenous people. Speaking about voting, the ACLU is really pushing against voter discrimination laws. And so they're pushing for example, areas that have states that have ID laws that prevent, for example, trans people from voting or incarcerated people from voting, for example. And then one other cause that I find particularly relevant is how the ACLU is really fighting against racial injustice. And so here I have a photo showing how they support protesting, but they're really interested in fighting against criminal injustice or the criminal justice system, as well as supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I do ask, if you can, please try to donate today. If you don't have the resources to do so, I also recommend donating your time. And so the ACLU has a lovely list of resources and petitions that you can sign or messages that you can send that you can filter based on the time that you have available to you. And so thank you so much. And I hope you take some time to look into the ACLU today. And so getting into the science a little bit. And so I'm going to talk to you today about how you can harness your imagination to reframe negative memories. And I want to start with a sort of a silly example to get us going. And so here is Mango the cat. Mango was really tired of doing work, didn't want to study for his exam, and subsequently failed his test. And later, while trying to process what happened, Mango had, a bunch of thoughts like, I can't believe I failed that test. The questions were so difficult, they were so hard. If only I had studied more, and then I could have been more prepared and gotten a better grade. And so one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how we process these sorts of stressful events. And I'm really interested in that middle one that I showed you here. How are we processing events by using imagination, imagining alternative versions? And so philosophers term this counterfactual thinking. And so counterfactual thought is just a fancy way of saying imagining alternative versions of past events, thinking of things like what could have been or if only, these sorts of statements that we create all the time. And here I show you one example of a counterfactual thought that might actually help us plan for the future, right? So maybe the next time I have a test, I might actually study more, prepare better, and that'll help me get the A that I was looking for. Counterfactual thoughts also have a variety of other uses. And so, for example, they can help us feel better about a situation. And so if I got into a car accident, I might think, well, at least I didn't get hurt, right? So I'm creating this counterfactual of getting hurt, realizing I didn't get hurt, and feeling better about the reality. They can also help us access creative solutions. And so if I left the house without my umbrella, I might think, oh, well, I could have used my bag to cover my head. And so again, creating this alternative reality, imagining some sort of scenario to benefit us in some way. And so here I'm talking about some of the beneficial ways we can use counterfactual thinking, but not all counterfactual thinking is good. And so there's a lot of research showing that counterfactual thinking is actually a key contributor to rumination and worry. And after a stressful event, the greater counterfactual creation is often linked to having greater stress outcomes later. And so how do we then modulate thinking about counterfactual thinking as a positive thing, but also have it be this negative thing that many people, especially people with high levels of rumination and worry, are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so what I want to focus on this talk is kind of thinking of and using counterfactual thinking intentionally to help us regulate our emotional memories. And with this reframing, I'm hoping to especially target some of those negative outcomes that we see in rumination. And so the reason I think that this can be a very effective regulation strategy is, one, I think counterfactual thinking we know that it has emotional consequences. We know that if I compare reality to something that was better, like I should have gotten that A, I'm going to feel regret. I'm going to feel regret that I didn't study more. Counterfactual thinking also leads to emotions like disappointment, relief, contentment, and I'll talk a little bit more about those a little later. We also know that counterfactual thinking is a very versatile manipulation. People can create counterfactual thoughts naturally. We do this, as I said, almost every day on our own. And so it may not require much training to train somebody to do this properly. It's also very versatile in the way it can be used. It can be used to, in response to any scenario. Every memory you have or every event that occurs, you can create a counterfactual to. And so I think it has a lot of application. And actually, there are people already using counterfactual thinking in therapeutic contexts. And so there is a type of therapy called imagery rescripting, which functions very similarly to a counterfactual. And so what the therapist has the client do is they're asked first to vividly remember the memory that's causing them stress, and then imagine how it could have gone differently at a pivotal moment. So essentially, they're creating a counterfactual of that memory. And a lot of the reports of imagery rescripting suggest that clients are then less affected by the memory and more receptive to future treatment. And so this is really, really promising. It seems like this is something that's already being used. It has some positive effects. However, when we look at the research done on imagery rescripting and counterfactual use in this beneficial way, a lot of the studies are not well controlled, and a lot of them are based on case studies or individual participants. And so I'm going to focus my talk on trying to make counterfactual thinking more of an established and understood emotion regulation strategy. And I'm going to do this through three main questions I'm going to ask today. The first is, how does counterfactual thinking compare to traditional emotion regulation techniques? And so there's a wide swath of techniques that are regularly used in therapy as well as in research. Counterfactual thinking is not one of them. Can we compare these to see how effective it is against what is tried and true? The second question I have is, are there specific features that characterize regulatory counterfactual thinking? And lastly, what are the mechanisms that are occurring behind regulatory counterfactual thinking? And so let's start with the first one. Let's start with a comparison. And before I get too much into the nitty-gritty of the research, I want to talk a little bit about how we talk about counterfactuals, some of the terminology we use. And so we often categorize counterfactuals into two different directions. And so we have upward counterfactuals, which are essentially alternatives that are better than reality, right? So I gave an example of this earlier. I could have studied more for my test and done better. And then conversely, we have downward counterfactuals, which are alternatives that are worse than reality. And so an example of this, again, with the same memory might be, well, at least my exam didn't affect my overall grade, right? So the worst counterfactual here is it could have affected my overall grade, it didn't. And so we're comparing this downward counterfactual to reality. And the reason we classify counterfactuals as upward or downward is because we think they have different emotional outcomes. And so upward counterfactual thoughts are often associated with regret. I'm comparing a better version to my actual situation and I feel bad about what happened. I feel regretful. But as I mentioned earlier, this might provide us some possible future solutions to what to do when the situation occurs again. A downward counterfactual, on the other hand, elicits emotions like relief, because now we're comparing a worse version of what happened to our reality, and we're feeling better about the fact that it could have, at least it's not as bad as it could have been. And so for this study particularly, I'm going to focus on downward counterfactual thinking because it already has the feeling of a natural emotion regulation strategy. So the second question then is, which technique should we compare it to? And the technique that I actually chose for this is temporal distancing. And so temporal distancing looks like this. Imagine what your life will be like in 10 years from now. How would you feel about this memory then? And so it has some similarities to counterfactual thinking. And so the reasons I chose temporal distancing, one is that it is very commonly used already in cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a very common way to manage and process emotions and negative events that have happened to you. Yet it's not too similar to counterfactual thinking. And so the key distinction here is that counterfactual thinking is really focused on the past, whereas temporal distancing is really asking you to project yourself into the future. Nonetheless, the two are similar in effort. They both require some sort of imagining, creation of some sort of scenario. And so I hope that they will be matched in effort, if not matched in actual quantity or quality. And so for this experiment, we had participants come and give us 30 regretful memories that they had in the last 5 years. They rated these on a variety of different scales. And so let me show you an example of what this looked like. And so, for example, my regretful memory might be that I watched the British Bake Off instead of preparing for my talk. And then I might rate how negative to positive this memory feels for me right now. So I'll say this is a fairly negative memory. I'll rate it on how intense or how excited it makes me feel. And so it's a medium on arousal, right? I feel a lot of regret about it. It's medium in detail, and I think about it fairly regularly. And so participants do the same sort of questionnaire for every one of their 30 memories. And then 2 to 6 days later, participants come into the lab and they're asked to think about these memories in a specific format. And so for a third of their memories, they're asked to create that downward counterfactual. What if it was worse? For another third of their memories, they're asked to create a temporal distancing scenario, right? So how will you feel about this event in 10 years from now? And for the last third, they're just simply asked to remember the memory. And so, just think about the memory again for 8 seconds. And that is kind of the baseline or the control manipulation here. A day later, participants come back. They remember all of their memories again, and they re-rate them on those emotional and detail measures that we asked them on the first day. We also asked them a question about how we presented this memory on session 2. We're not as interested in this measure particularly, but the real measures of interest are how their ratings, especially their emotional ratings, change from session 1 to session 3. And so thinking about our hypotheses, we expect counterfactual thinking to be as effective as temporal distancing. At least that's the hope, right? We know counterfactual thinking is effective. Can it kind of match what we know temporal distancing can do? And then secondarily, we're looking specifically at regretful memories here because we know regret is a counterfactual emotion. And so maybe downward counterfactual thoughts can be especially effective at reducing regret. We also took some additional measures just to control for some other things that might be happening here. The main one of which was a general anxiety level scale. And so we hoped with this scale that we would capture some of that rumination activity we think might be related to maladaptive counterfactual thinking. And so in this scale, participants were asked to rate how they generally felt from almost never to almost always. Some of these questions were more about their kind of being or their self of like how they felt on a day-to-day basis. I feel secure, I feel nervous and restless. But some of them were much more specific. And so we have, I worry too much over something that really doesn't matter. I take disappointments so keenly that I can't put them out of my mind. I get in a state of tension or turmoil as I think over my recent concerns and interests. And so you can see these 3 questions especially really pull at that rumination, and you can see how they might be tied to counterfactual thinking as well. We also took a couple other measures that I'm not going to get a chance to talk about today, but I do want to bring them up. And so we also collected information about muscle movement, specifically about movement of the corrugator supercilii muscle, which is just the muscle right above the eyebrow. The reason we chose this muscle is because it tends to furrow. You tend to furrow your eyebrows when you're in a negative mood. I recommend you try it out on your own when you get a chance. And so we hope that this would act as a secondary measure to some of the ratings that the participants were giving us themselves. We also looked at a baseline measure of traditional emotion regulation use. And so we hope that if people were already using things like temporal distancing on a day-to-day basis, we could capture some of that information with this questionnaire. And so getting to our main question, right? Does it work? Does counterfactual thinking look like temporal distancing? And here I'm showing you a graph of valence change. And so that's the scale that goes from negative to positive. And specifically, I'm looking at the change from session 3 to session 1. And so a positive number here indicates that they should be feeling happier or more positive. And if we look at counterfactual thinking and temporal distancing, they look fairly similar, which is really, really exciting. They perform similarly. But then when we look at remember, it performs about the same. And so this is kind of interesting. On average, for our participants, it seems like regardless of what technique they're using, just thinking about the memory in some way seems to be making them feel better about it by the end of our experiment. And this is the general trend we see for valence, right? That negative to positive measure. Also for arousal, so how much calmer do you feel at the end of the experiment? How much detail changes from beginning to end? And how much regret changes from beginning to end? And so I show these all fairly quickly just to say that it seems like counterfactual thinking and temporal distancing are both effective at reducing negative emotions, but they're doing so at about the same rate as just recalling the memory itself. Okay, so maybe what's happening is we're not capturing all of the information that there is to see here. And so I do want to look at that anxiety measure to see maybe if the way that we're ruminating outside of using these techniques are affecting how effective these techniques are for us. And so looking at, are there differences in effectiveness across anxiety level? And here we are looking at arousal. And so arousal, again, is that scale of looking at how calm to excited you feel when you think about your memory, or kind of how intense the emotion is for you. And here a negative score means you feel calmer about the information by the end. And now what we're seeing on the bottom, on the x-axis here, is looking at across anxiety level. And so we're gonna look at each individual technique and how maybe a person's anxiety interacts with that technique to reduce their arousal. And what we see now is that for when you're just recalling a memory or rehearsing a memory, across your anxiety level really doesn't seem to matter much. But when you're using counterfactual thinking or temporal distancing, here we see that people with higher levels of anxiety actually benefit more from using these two techniques. And so a little bit of differentiation between kind of temporal distancing, the established technique, counterfactual thinking, our tried technique, and maybe just thinking about it again. We can also look at regret. And so as a reminder, we think counterfactual thinking might be especially important for regret because it is highly linked together. And this is in fact what we do see. We see that when using counterfactual thinking, people with higher levels of anxiety are actually benefiting more. They're feeling less regret by the end of the experiment compared to their lower anxiety peers. And doing this at a rate much greater than, for example, the effects of just remembering the memory itself. And so as an interim summary, there is some positive evidence for counterfactual thinking being effective, particularly for participants with high anxiety. And counterfactual thinking seems to have a special relationship with regret, where it seems to be helping people with high levels of anxiety better than it seems to be helping people with low levels of anxiety. And so now that we know that it seems like it's effective, it has some merit, the next question then is, well, how is it working? What specific aspects of counterfactual thinking might be different, especially in people with anxiety versus low levels of anxiety? And so I'm really interested in looking at the phenomenology, or kind of the characteristics that are occurring when different people are thinking about counterfactual thinking. And particularly want to ask, are there differences in the way that people with anxiety think of counterfactual thoughts? Some of the motivation behind this is that we know that mental health does interact with the way we think about our memories. And so people with depression and PTSD tend to overgeneralize their memories. And people who tend to ruminate also report their memories as negatively skewed and less specific. And so we want to know, do these sorts of patterns emerge also when they're thinking about counterfactual thoughts? So for this experiment, we recruited around 100 participants online using Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Each of them had to think of 6 regretful memories. And then we asked them for each of their memories to describe in great detail a specific scenario. So for 2 of those memories, they were asked to remember the memory in great detail. For 2, we asked them to create a better version of the memory. And for 2 of them, we asked them to create a worse version of the memory. And once they had done this description, they were asked a long series of questions about each of the memories and each of the scenarios. And so I'll show them kind of piecemeal here. So we asked a series of questions about how the sensory information was about the scenario you just created. So how clear was the simulation? How much color was there? Smell, touch, sound, etc. We asked a group of questions about the composition. And so where were people located? Where were objects located? Can you think about all of that? How clear was the time of day? We asked a group of questions about emotional valence and intensity. And so can you think about how you would have felt? How negative to positive would it have been? How intense would it have been? And then we asked a couple questions, kind of the grab bag, a couple extra questions as well. And so overall, how do you imagine this event? How likely is it that this event could have happened to you in the past? And from what perspective do you think about this event? In addition to all of these questions that the participants answered, we also took their descriptions and analyzed the text from those descriptions. And so things that we were looking for included things like, how many emotional words were there? We literally took a count using some software of how many positive words were included in their descriptions versus how many negative words were included in their descriptions. We took a measure of linguistic distance. And so this is a measure approximating how close, how personal, how present the text is. And so hopefully this gives us a sense of, is the person writing this description feeling very close to it, or are they kind of distanced from it a little bit? And then we also calculated a measure of abstraction from the text, which essentially captured how detailed or how concrete the text was by comparing the number of nouns and adjectives to action verbs, for example, which are a lot more direct and detailed. And so I'm not going to be able to show you all the analyses today, unfortunately, but I want to highlight some of the interesting things we found from this. And so looking at the text analysis first, and again, we're interested in this relationship across anxiety. We find that people with higher levels of anxiety tend to use more negative words in their descriptions, regardless of what their description is. And so we see some patterns that make sense, right? When you're describing a worse version, hopefully you're using more negative terms than when you're describing a better version. But in general, you see that there's a positive trend amongst all 3 of those lines. We also looked at compositional details, and here we see the opposite effect, where people with higher levels of anxiety are using less compositional details. They have less of an idea of where the objects are, less an idea of how clear the time of day was, etc. And this is especially true for upward counterfactual thoughts, so those better counterfactuals. And just to throw in one of the grab bag questions that we thought was particularly interesting, we looked at how likely it was that the event could have happened to you in the past. And here what we see is a marked decline across anxiety for upward counterfactual thoughts. And so people with high levels of anxiety felt it was much less likely that a good version of the reality that they had could have happened to them. They felt it was much less likely. And so this result in particular is really interesting if we think about the neural basis of counterfactual thinking. And so, excuse me. So we know that counterfactual thoughts tend to activate regions of what we call the default mode network, or also referred to as the core activation network. And so here what I'm showing you on the left is a picture from Wikipedia of a typical default mode network activation. And on the right, I'm showing you our results looking at counterfactual thinking, and you see very similar activation. And the reason I bring this up is that we know that default network activity varies depending upon the type of counterfactual you're creating. And so specifically, we have evidence showing that when you're creating a counterfactual that you think is more likely to happen versus one that's more unlikely to happen, the likely one is actually activating more default network activity areas. And so tying this back to what we just saw, perhaps for people with high levels of anxiety, they're not activating the default network in the same way when they're creating upward counterfactual thoughts compared to people with lower levels of anxiety. I also want to give you a couple of other things that might affect default network activity as a preview for some of the work that we're still doing. And so we also know that counterfactuals about yourself activate more default network than counterfactuals about other people, as well as counterfactuals with more episodic information, so event information versus semantic content or more facts. And I bring this up largely to say we are doing there is some ongoing work occurring where we're actually having participants come in. We recorded 1 to 3 minute interviews with them. And these participants vary along anxiety level. And we're now coding them for some of those other things that we think might vary along default network. And so things like episodic versus semantic information, use of personal pronouns. Hopefully we can tease out some of these other things that might be related as well. And so just as a summary of that, we do think that there are specific features that characterize regulatory counterfactual thinking, specifically in people with high levels of anxiety. It seems like people with high levels of anxiety are thinking about their counterfactual thoughts in incredibly novel ways or different ways. And so with that knowledge, can we get at some of the potential mechanisms that are occurring behind regulatory counterfactual thinking? And to introduce this topic, I want to talk a little bit about memory. And so here I'm going to present to you a picture that I took at the Whitney Museum of American Art last November. It's a little small to see, but this is a room that was created, an art installation within the museum that is entirely covered in beads. Every surface is covered in beads. Every item is made out of beads. And I remember just being so enthralled by it, by the color, by the artistry, the work that went into it. And when I think about this memory, and when we think about maybe the way that memory has been traditionally thought of, if I remember it now, one would think that it's exactly like this picture, that I can just bring it up and it is exactly as I remember it from when I was there. But in reality, the memory kind of changes over time, right? So I might have seen a Tide detergent at the grocery store, which might remind me of this art installation. But now when it's reminded me, I remember that Tide detergent really well, but the rest of the room has kind of faded and my memory of the whole event has slightly faded. And now I might remember that event again and that museum again, and that memory might be kind of shrouded in nostalgia and sadness because I can't go travel or go into museums as easily anymore. And so I bring up this example to characterize that memories do change over time. And every time we remember a memory, there's opportunities for that memory to pick up new context from the time that we're remembering, right? So especially with that last one, I'm incorporating the pandemic into my memory of this event that occurred in 2019. And so memories can be modified. And it seems like memories are modified in very specific ways. And so I want to talk about what is required for a memory to be modified when it's brought up again. There's two main steps that are required. One is that the memory needs to be imperfectly remembered. And so, like I said, we have to bring up the memory for it to change, but not just bring up the memory, we have to bring it up in a kind of an imperfect way. And this is important. I'm going to borrow from my colleague Sam Gershman here to talk about how the imperfect memory is particularly relevant. And so if we think about this x-axis here is like our trigger for the memory, for example, and our y-axis talks about, do we need to change our understanding or do we need to modify the memory at all? And so looking at the kind of 0, 0 mark, this means that whatever triggered our memory is exactly what we think it is. They match 100%. And it makes then logical sense that there's no need for us to modify the memory. Everything lines up. On the other end of the spectrum, here we have some trigger that brings up a memory that is so radically different from what we're experiencing that we can't find a way to mesh the two together. And so what we say is, this is just going to be a new memory. This is going to be other information that I have. It's not necessarily related to this information that I have. But in this middle sweet spot, this is where something brings up a memory for us. And it's related, but it's slightly off. And so now, right, I'm in a pandemic. I'm thinking about museums. And I'm like, this really reframes the way that I think about going to a museum. And I'm going to incorporate that into my information of how my museum visit was. And so it's this really fuzzy middle area that allows for the most memory change. So that's step number one. The second step is then we have to interfere with the actual memory. And so while it's in this unstable, fuzzy state, there needs to be some reason to change it, something that occurs that actually allows for some sort of change. And so I'm spending a lot of time on this to say, we think this is what's happening in therapy. We think this has a lot of therapeutic relevance. What we hope is what's happening in therapy is when you have a traumatic event or some sort of negative memory, you think about it in the context of therapy, and you begin to incorporate those safe contexts into the memory, and you reinforce that safe memory so that it's kind of the prevailing memory that's been modified and is safe now. I want to propose using counterfactual thinking as a modification for memories as well. And so the reason I think this can be particularly useful is because counterfactual thinking, in the way that we do it, imperfectly brings up an associated memory, right? By creating a better version of a memory or by creating a worse version of a memory, we see that we have to bring up some memory content, but it's not exactly the same. And from the last experiment we just saw, we saw that especially for people with high levels of anxiety, it does bring up some sort of information, but it's not perfect. It has less detail, right? There's generally some sort of murkiness associated with that counterfactual thought. And so this is kind of where I want to go with this last study that I'm going to show you. And to further show that this might be possible, there is also some evidence from our lab actually that shows that memory modification can be, you can use emotion regulation to modify a memory. And so we actually did a study in which we had participants learn pictures and then imperfectly recall the picture. So we showed them only a partial part of the picture to hopefully create a sort of a fuzzy memory recall. And then we asked them to do some sort of regulation. And so here we used a more traditional regulation technique. Imagine this object is extremely far away from you. This is another version of distancing, not temporal distancing. This is spatial distancing. And so you're putting yourself physically far away from the object. But what we found is that when we did this combination of an imperfect trigger and a regulation, we saw marked decreases in arousal to those picture memories 24 hours later. And so with all this evidence, we jumped into a new study, and this is pretty raw data, and so not finalized yet, but I wanted to share with you because I'm pretty excited about what we have here. And so we brought people into the lab, fairly similar setup to the other study you saw. We had them generate 45 regretful memories and rate them on a variety of emotional measures, which you're all familiar with now. A week later, we had them come in, and here we slightly modified the experiment. And so for every single memory, they first started by remembering the event. then for a third of the trials, they actually stopped there. They just remembered the event and then they went on to the next memory. For a second third of the trials, they first remembered the memory and then they were asked to create a better counterfactual. And for the last third, they remembered the memory and then were asked to create a worse counterfactual. 24 hours later, participants came back and they were asked to remember all the memories again. They re-rated them on these emotional measures. And again, we asked them a source memory question. Do you remember how this memory was presented in session 2? Again, this wasn't our main focus, but we thought would be interesting to include as well. Crucially, we're interested in the differences between ratings here and ratings at session 3 and ratings at session 1. And also, this time, we put sessions 2 and session 3 inside an fMRI scanner. And so we could also look at their brain activity as they were doing these different tasks. And so I want to talk about the neural analyses a little bit first. And so the neural analyses we did to look at the brain activity here is a technique called partial least squares analysis. And so in a very simplified version, what they're doing here is there's a computer software or algorithm that's teasing apart these different techniques. And so it's, say, all the blue ones, for example, are worse counterfactuals. All the green ones are better counterfactuals. All the red ones are remembering. And so what they're doing is they're looking at the activation in the brain during each of these different events, and they're trying to cluster them. So are there similarities between all the times that they're creating a worse counterfactual? And are there some, making these sorts of similarity maps? And then essentially what the algorithm is doing is then saying, great, so we have these kind of scores, these 3-dimensional or however dimensional scores for each of these activation patterns. Is there a way that we can separate them across different conditions? And so here we have a plane that might be separating remembering conditions from the counterfactual conditions. And then the last step of that is to say, okay, now what brain regions are responsible for that? And so the time periods that we were particularly interested in looking at were when they're remembering the memory at session 2 and when they're remembering the memory at session 3. Because here the task is entirely the same. They're remembering the same memory. The only thing that's changed is whether they manipulated the memory in the middle of those 2 recall sessions. And so I want to first talk to you about the results of the partial least squares analysis. And so here, the brain scores are kind of arbitrary. They don't mean too much. What's really important to look at here, so these last 3 are the session 3 remembering, but separated by what manipulation was done on session 2. And this first one here is the session 2 remembering. And anything that kind of crosses the middle line is considered not really contributing to one side or the other. But what we do see separated is memories that were previously manipulated using an upward counterfactual and memories that were previously manipulated using a downward counterfactual. And so what we might expect, knowing what we know so far, is that remembering a memory might be influenced by the counterfactual creation, right? We think there's some sort of modification happening. And because we know that worse counterfactuals are considered more likely by people with higher levels of anxiety, we expect there to be more default mode network activity in the memories that were associated with a worse counterfactual than a better counterfactual. And this is exactly what we see. So here are the regions that were activated more for this condition than for this condition. So more for memories that were previously worse than memories that were previously better. And they look just like the default network activity we've seen so far. And so how do these translate to behavioral changes? And so we might expect, knowing memory modification, we need some sort of imperfect remembering. And so maybe the most weakly remembered memories, which might be the upward counterfactuals because they least activate the default network, maybe those are going to be the most affected at influencing behavior. And so when we look at valence score here, so again, a more positive number means they felt more positive about their memory at the end. We see anxiety is really influencing how they feel. So less anxiety means they feel happier. But when you look at the worst counterfactuals and the better counterfactuals, you actually see that creating a better counterfactual attenuates that negative slope quite significantly. And so as a kind of a overall summary here, I hope that you agree that counterfactual thinking can be used as an effective emotion regulation technique, particularly for people with high anxiety. And I put that just a small caveat here that we didn't look at depression. Depression is equally associated with things like rumination and worry. And so that would be something that would be really interesting to look at in the future. People who are highly anxious have trouble imagining their simulations clearly, especially upward counterfactuals. And we think that this may create greater instability during memory recall, which allows them to lead to lasting memory change. And so with that, I'd like to thank all the people that were involved with these projects, previous advisors, current advisors, many undergraduates, and I hope you learned something today. I hope to keep in touch with all of you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks for that great talk, Natasha. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and so I think you can bring that up and also look at them, but I'll go ahead and read them out loud as well. The first question is it possible that individuals who are simply recalling the negative memory are defaulting to a reappraisal strategy? How do traumatic memories that interfere with the ability to accurately recall memories or envision the future interfere with the emotional regulation strategies discussed here? I wonder if binning the memory items on that were rated high on arousal and valence show a different impact of emotional regulation than those rated low. Yeah,
that's a great point. And so I think binning the ones that are especially traumatic might be really interesting. We think that there might be some differences even across anxiety on how traumatic or how bad people are reporting their memories to be. And so I think that's definitely an interesting avenue of future research. I think regarding for the people who are just doing the pure remembering, especially in the first study that I presented, I do think that there might be a lot of reappraisal that they're actually using when they're just remembering the memory itself. There is research showing that when you introduce people to temporal distancing, for example, there is a lot of bleed over into just remembering other memories as well. And so that might be something that was influencing how we saw remembering looking the same as temporal distancing and counterfactual thinking. So I think those are definitely possibilities that need to be teased out a little bit more.
And then the second question is it fair to say that optimism versus pessimism are oppositely valenced forms of counterfactual thinking?
That's really interesting. I don't think optimism and pessimism are purely counterfactual, right? We can be optimistic about things that happen in the future. We can be optimistic about things that are happening now. But I do think when we refer to counterfactual thinking, optimism, I wouldn't call them differently valenced counterfactuals. I think that you can probably frame the same counterfactual in an optimistic or a pessimistic view, right? So I didn't study for my exam, I failed my test. An optimist might view that as an opportunity to do better in the future. A pessimist might view that as something to ruminate on. And so maybe the way that they are experienced might be different from an optimist or a pessimistic view. I don't necessarily think that they would influence or are specifically related to the types of counterfactuals that might be created.
Great. The next question says, I work on the consolidation and reconsolidation of memories during sleep. I would be, oops, it moved. Sorry, one sec. I would be interested whether there is research on the impact of sleep on memory modification techniques, probably not yet for counterfactual thinking, but for already established techniques. And I would imagine that in interventions done in the evening or instructions to remember the intervention before going to bed would increase therapeutic success. Is that a potential benefit or that a potential benefit only becomes apparent after several nights of sleep? Is there research on that?
I don't know of any work in the counterfactual realm specifically involving sleep, but I really love the idea that maybe doing some of these things right before bed might aid the reconsolidation process or that memory modification process. I know that there is some work generally with reconsolidation in sleep. For example, introducing odors or things like that in the sleep process that might modify the memory. But I'm not like super familiar in that area. But I do think that it would be a very interesting avenue of future research.
Great. The next question says, great talk and work. Do you have thoughts on why imagery rescripting is less common than imaginal exposure, involving recounting or prospecting about an imagined experience, but without enumerating counterfactuals in therapies for anxiety disorders, for example, exposure and response prevention, or prolonged exposure? I'm wondering if this has to do with the structure of memory, where recollection itself automatically evokes counterfactuals, even if they're not explicitly enumerated, and if it relates to your results that, one, recollection itself improved emotional valence of the memory, at least as a main effect, and two, read the implausibility of better counterfactuals for the more anxious.
Yeah, some wonderful questions there. And so I'm going to try to, there was a lot in there, so I'm going to try to pull up the question if I can as well. But Luke, could you just repeat the beginning part of the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. Do you have thoughts on why imagery rescripting is less
Yes.
common than imaginal exposure?
Thank you. Perfect. Yeah, so I think the reason that we see a lot more imaginal exposure is mostly just the way that therapists try to use these different techniques. And so I think, at least from the papers that I've read, imagery rescripting seems like a second step or a last resort almost, where they will try imaginal exposure first. And so they will try to get the client to work with the memory, think about it, really live in that moment, process it. But if the client is maybe too affected by the memory or unable to process it in that way, then it seems like that's when imagery rescripting seems to come into play. And so the way that it's currently used, it seems like it's, okay, this imaginal exposure is not working, maybe let's try imagery rescripting instead. And I think, as maybe this talk might convince you to think, I think that maybe we should reverse those. I think maybe it might be more beneficial to jumpstart the process with some sort of memory modification via counterfactual thinking or imagery rescripting, and then move to that second step instead. I know there was a second part of that question, Luke, that I'm blanking on already.
Yes, the second part was, I'm wondering if this has to do with the structure of memory, where recollection itself automatically evokes counterfactuals, and if it relates to your results that, one, recollection itself improved emotional valence of the memory, and two, the implausibility of better counterfactuals for the more anxious.
Yes, the short answer is yes. I think just remembering the memory, as we saw in the memory modification stuff that I presented, that has potential to change the memory on its own. And so I think there might be memory modification occurring every single time you recall a memory, even in imaginal exposure, for example. And I presented, I think, that study by Lane and colleagues that suggests that this might be what's happening in therapy already, that as we expose people to memory, as we have them recall their memories, we are getting them to change how they think about them. The reason I bring in counterfactual thinking is, again, I think maybe we can jumpstart that process, or maybe target those people who are having more trouble accessing the memories in the first place.
Great, and I think we have time for one more. So this one will be the last question, and it says, hi, Dr. Parikh, great presentation. I'm wondering, how many treatments would one with high anxiety need to achieve the purpose of effective emotional regulations? I suppose different individuals vary in their levels of anxiety that might affect the intensity of treatments that they need.
Great question. I think, so one of the nice things about counterfactual thinking is that you can do it once, you can do it multiple times, but it also seems to make people receptive to other types of therapy, right? So maybe one time thinking about an alternative version, really spending time with that version, maybe it'll help you process the memory enough that now you can be responsive to things like imaginal exposure or other therapies that you weren't responsive to before. And so I do think that a lot of it might vary from person to person. I'd like to think that even one exposure or one really concentrated effort in a counterfactual thought might be enough to shift you into a possibility of doing more counterfactual thinking, but also doing other sorts of therapies.
Great. So just wanted to thank you one more time, Dr. Parikh, for a great talk. It was super interesting. And we will see everyone back here next time for the next Innovators talk. Thanks, everyone.